Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a Triad podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Graham Taylor. My guest today is Dr. Greg Charlop. Greg is a physician, executive coach, and expert in wellness and burnout, dedicated to supporting professionals, especially those with children. As a founder of the Physician Wellness Project, Greg addresses burnout among physicians and nurses, offering tailored consulting to help them enhance their careers and achieve a healthier work-life balance. We're excited to have Greg with us today to explore strategies for assessing work-life relationships, rethinking career paths in light of longer life expectancies, and the role of creative outlets in enhancing well-being. Greg, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here with you and your amazing audience.
Very nice. Well, nice to have you. Thank you. Well, hey, as we start out today, Greg, share with us your story and the inspiration behind the Physician Wellness Project.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm a physician. I'm actually an anesthesiologist, a pediatric anesthesiologist by training, and I'm from California. I worked many years at a large tertiary hospital in Northern California, taking care of a lot of sick patients, busy, lots of call, nights, weekends, not a lot of free time. And I did that for many years. And then around 2018, 19, this is before the pandemic, I kind of realized I was starting to get, I maybe burned out or sort of on the cusp of being burned out, you could say. I didn't get as much joy in my job as I used to. You know, in the past, I used to kind of roll with the punches when I was on call or if I had a long day. But I was getting to the point where that stuff really started bothering me more. I remember Halloween came one day, which is one of our favorite holidays. And my kids, you know, they were young at the time. They were all dressed up in their Halloween costumes. They were super excited. But I couldn't go trick-or-treating with them because I had to work. And I felt really bad about that because they were really excited and they wanted me to go. And they were at an age where it meant a lot to them for me to go and I couldn't. And so that was hard on me, I'll be honest. And so that kind of made me rethink things. It made me rethink, what are my goals? What am I doing? Should I still be here? And after that, I made some major changes. I left this hospital, which is almost unprecedented. No one really left voluntarily unless they were retiring. I moved down to the Beverly Hills area. I started freelancing as a physician, and I finally started pursuing different creative projects that I wanted to do. I finished a couple of books. I worked with athletes. I did telemedicine. I worked in Beverly Hills. I did a lot of fun things that I've been wanting to do, but just hadn't been able to because my job was too demanding.
It's funny how some of our career paths, I think probably the best career paths that we can do, come out of our own experiences, you know, when we're living life and then we begin to recognize things. What I love, though, is that you were able to be aware, kind of introspective around, hey, I'm not getting the same kind of joy in my life or from my work, you know, things that I've trained for and love doing and love helping people through. Still good. I know that I'm doing right things, but the joy that I might normally get out of it isn't quite the same joy. Or you're talking about rolling with the punches, where we become a little less flexible, you know, elastic in the things that we do. We become a little more rigid. And maybe even some of the things that we would have tolerance for and patience for in the past, we're not quite as tolerant, maybe not quite as patient, are we? We'll begin to get a little crispy.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I do think a lot of this just also has to do with life stages and age. You know, obviously when you're younger, I do think you're better able to get by with maybe not sleeping as well, longer days, that sort of thing. But it's also a life stage. You know, early on when I started my career, I was single. I didn't have kids. I was living in a little tiny condo in San Francisco. It didn't really matter if I was working or not because, you know, I could do what I wanted. I controlled my own schedule. You know, there's no problem. But as you get older, your life stages change and your priorities change. And I think the problem is if your day-to-day actions don't match your priorities, then you get frustrated and you get burnt out. That's, I think, in my mind, that's a big kind of under-discussed source of burnout, which is that what we're doing day in and day out isn't taking us in the direction we want to go. We may not be able to articulate it that way, but I think that really frustrates us.
Yeah, I like that emphasis on appreciating kind of just our natural evolution and our developmental stages as we go through life. And we're coming out of school and in our 20s, and we're looking for careers, and everything is focused towards establishing ourselves, securing financial things, securing positions, and that's a good thing. And then if we're following natural developmental patterns, we're looking for a partner, we're establishing a family, homes, finances, and there's just a natural evolution. So the same ways of doing life professionally have to adjust, but sometimes we don't think that, or maybe we're not consciously aware that we have to adjust the work piece as well to fit into this. So this idea of our priorities shifting, our life stages changing, and what you're also offering here is that you caught some things early, and ideally we don't wait to we get burned out. I want to talk about what those signs and symptoms are, but there are some early indicators, aren't there, around us building kind of stress. We don't just get to a 10 by itself. We don't go from 0 to 10. There's a 1 through 9 in there. I liken it sometimes to the roller coaster, at the fair, where it's going click, 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 click up to the very top, and then it goes over the top, and then once you get to that 10, you can't stop it until you end up in the wheelhouse, and it's a wild ride until you do. But ideally, what you're suggesting is maybe we can catch some things early, like at the early stages, 1, 2, 3, the early click, click, clicks that we listen to, but sometimes ignore. What are some of the early clicks, if you will, some of the early indicators you were mentioning too? Not the same kind of joy, maybe a little fatigue, maybe not sleeping quite as well, maybe some inflexibility and elasticity. What are some others that we might notice?
Well, I think, for me, I loved being a doctor and I love going in, and I looked forward to it. And I felt like I was doing a good thing. I loved the people I was working with. I mean, there was really virtually nothing I didn't like. I mean, I never liked working overnight, but other than that, there was really nothing I didn't like. But gradually I noticed that the job changed from being, as you say, like a joy, something I was looking forward to being more like a job,
Yeah.
a paycheck. It put food on the table. And I appreciated I had the job and I was thankful I could help people, but it didn't bring me energy. I think it moved from
Good point.
bringing me energy to taking away energy. And I was surprised by that. I didn't expect that. It was different than I had felt before. So that was surprising to me. I think another thing that I came to realize is I felt that I became about as good as I would be in my profession. You know, I think, you're if you were to graph sort of your ability over time, I think it shoots up, but then it kind of plateaus off.
Right.
So I felt that I had more or less hit the plateau. I mean, maybe I could learn a little technical thing here, a little technical thing there, but for the most part, I felt that I had achieved what I could achieve in my job. So
Mhm.
staying longer, and I remember thinking this too, it's kind of an odd, maybe a cold way of looking at it, but I remember thinking I could stay longer and I'm probably not going to get any better, but I'm just going to get more and more frustrated. And I'm going to keep missing these times with my kids. I'm going to not be sleeping or going to the gym and stuff as much as I wanted. And I could see that was going to become less and less fulfilling with time. Like the trajectory was only going to go down.
Mm. I really like what you're saying here too. The things that we do in life, ideally, I mean, there's always the humbug stuff. There's always the stuff that we just got to grind out and do. That's just part of life. And we got to do hard work. We got to do it well. And it's something that helps us grow and our own self-discipline and things. But there's got to be aspects of our life and things that we're doing in our life that bring us energy, that there's a return on an investment, things that are generative. And what you're saying here is that the things I was loving doing maybe weren't bringing me the same energy. And maybe it's also part of a life stage too, where you're saying there were other things in my life that were bringing me energy, maybe the marriage, the family growing, the time with the kids, Halloween, all those were bringing energy and joy as well, and trying to find that balance. So I love the idea that the things we invest ourselves in ideally have a generative piece to it as a return on that investment. You're also saying too that maybe our identity gets to shift a wee bit too. As professionals, we often, particularly men, I think sometimes a little bit more than women, we really identify with our career. We're the docs, we're the this, we're the that, whatever it may be. It doesn't matter the title. But then our priorities get to shift, and maybe our identity expands a wee bit, doesn't it? Hey, I'm a father now. I'm in charge of these kids. And it sounds like part of your identity was growing as your kids began to age, and that became a kind of a really sweet part of your life.
Yeah, and I love the way you put that, and I agree. And my take on this is that it's important that we periodically reassess our goals. And what I believe happens, and I've worked with a lot of people, physicians and other folks who are burnt out or frustrated. And one of the things I've noticed is I think that when we're in our 40s, 50s, 60s, we're often still living by the goals we had as teenagers.
Right.
And what I mean by that is think of yourself, your professional goals as a 16-year-old. You probably wanted to be at the top of your profession. You probably wanted to make a lot of money. You probably wanted to be famous. You wanted to have power and influence. Like these are the things, every teenager wants. That's what you want as a teenager. But as you get older, your priorities change. Those are not necessarily the most important thing for most, say, 40-year-olds or 50-year-olds.
Right.
Eventually, some of the most important things are spending time with loved ones, protecting your health,
Yes.
learning something new, being with your kids or parents, or you get, as you said, kind of a more expansive view of self. And perhaps things like power, fame, making the most money, those things become less important.
Right.
But unless you intentionally change your life, you're still doing the steps one would do to pursue your teenage goals,
Yeah.
even though now in your 40s, 50s, 60s, your goals have changed.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Whether you're a longtime or first-time listener to Behavioral Health Today, you're probably familiar with Triad, the company that brings you this podcast. But you may not know that Triad also hosts a community for current and aspiring behavioral and mental health professionals, featuring trending content and education and career resources, all for free. If you are a behavioral or mental health professional, or you're studying to become one, join more than 80,000 people on Triad by claiming your free professional account today. Visit us at hellotriad.com/BHT. That's hellotriad.com/BHT and join the Triad community today.
Yeah. I love the idea of kind of maybe having these periodic pit stops where we stop and literally go under the hood and assess some of the things you're saying, including reassessing our goals and maybe the stage of my life. And also if we're, and I like to think that this would be under the umbrella of maturity, where our goals aren't the same when we're 16. I don't want to have a 16-year-old goal at 36 or 56. I want those goals to mature. And I also get to recognize what I love that you're saying too, is that maybe my roles in other people's lives as well, maybe my partners, maybe my kids, they need me to have updated goals and to be reassessing what they need of me as well. What are some of the ways that you take, Greg, people through assessing these things that you're describing right now? What do you walk them through? What do you encourage them to take a look at?
That's a great question. So, I will say that a lot of my thinking on this was actually shaped by a book called Die with Zero, which I recommend to everybody. I have a sort of a reading list I recommend to everybody. Die with Zero, which I know is a little controversial, but that's one of the books I recommend to everybody. But one of the things that I like to tell people, and I kind of stole this from that book, is that you have different windows of opportunity in your life to do different things. So you have health, and that health will change as you get older, but other people's health and life change. So for example, if it's important for you to spend a lot of time with your kids, that's much easier to do when they're living in your house than it is when they're 30. Because at that point, they've got their own family, they've got their own kids, they still love you, but they've got their own stuff going on.
Yeah.
When they're 10, if you say, let's go out, do something, they're all for it.
Yeah.
Same thing if you want to do something with your parents. If your parents are, still relatively young and in good shape, say they're healthy 60, 70-year-olds, and you want to take a trip to Europe with them or something, you could do that now. If you keep putting that off, eventually they could pass away, their health could decline, things could happen that may make that trip to Europe you wanted to take go away.
Yeah, that window closes, sadly.
The windows close, and even and no one likes to think about this, but even your physical health changes.
Yes.
Like say your goal is to backpack across Asia. That's something you really want to do. You could probably do that in your 20s, 30s, maybe 40s. You're not doing that most likely in your 70s.
Yeah.
So if you want to do that, you should do that now rather than
Yeah.
keep putting that stuff off.
Yeah. When you raise it this way too, we get to realize that, yeah, we are living longer, than previous generations, and there's a number of reasons for that. And I think I think there's the opportunity to live longer. I'm a pretty big fan of the Netflix and the program Blue Zones with Dan Buettner. I watched the show, and I live in Hawaii, and we have a really nicely aging population here, and some into their hundreds, which is beautiful. And I got onto the Blue Zones. I feel like I've become one of their apostles or one of their evangelists because I just absolutely love it, and I'd love to have them on the show someday. Because these are things that we have found and distilled down that we can actually do, like you're saying right now, and we can actually make a part of our lives to extend it and live longer than previous generations, not just medically, enhanced, but also things that we can basically do that are accessible to every single one of us. But as we think about living longer, we also get to think about, hey, what is my career trajectory going to be, or what do I want it to be? And what might my retirement plans be in there? Because there's some windows that do close, and some things we want to stay open. And speak to that a little bit for us, would you?
Yeah, I love this. Is actually one of my favorite topics to discuss. I'm thrilled that you brought it up. And going back to that 16-year-old concept, it used to be like our parents and grandparents, they work, they typically would do the same job. They do it till say 60, 65, they retire. And if they were lucky, they'd have maybe a few fun years of retirement. Then they'd kind of settle up, and just watch TV. Now, we and all of us, we kind of choose our professions to some degree, again, around 16. I decided I would go into medicine around that age. Of course, I didn't know I'd make it, but that was what I decided. We all kind of chose, I think, more or less what we were going to do when we were late teenagers. And so, we executed the plan. We did what we set out to do. But as you said, say we live to be 100.
Yeah.
There is a good chance that if we're living to 100, we may work, maybe not full time, but we may work till we're 75, 80. We may not want to be retired for 40 years. For a lot of people, that isn't even an attractive idea. You feel like you're going to get bored. Most people want to be productive. The people listening to your show, they're high performing people. They want to in some way be productive. The idea of sitting around doing nothing is not appealing. So
yeah, Freud. Yeah, I think even Freud said we need to do two things in life. We need to love and we need to work. I think he missed one thing. I think we need to play. You missed that third one, but we need to love and we need to work. You're right. We do need to work and be generative in some way, contributing, don't we?
Exactly. And that's where the 16-year-old thing comes in again, which is if you're 50, 60, you may still, with longer lives, you may still work another 20 years.
That's right.
Should you feel obligated as a 15-year-old to do the same job that you chose to do as a 16-year-old? In other words, at 16, are you able to look 50 or 60 years out into the future and predict what you will want to do that far out? And I would say probably not.
Yeah, I think you're right. When you think about, and the folks you work with, I want to get maybe a little into the weeds a little bit here with you. When you're working with folks and you're talking about, flexibility in their career choices or ways that you're encouraging them to realize if we're going to be in this career for a while, what are going to be some of the creative outlets that they can build into their lives to, recognize the early clicks, on the roller coaster and ways that they can take some practical steps? What are you encouraging people to think just in terms of setting a mindset for themselves?
So I think the creative outlet thing is very important. I think most successful people are fairly creative and they have some diverse interests. And a lot of us had to kind of suppress those interests while we were rising up in our career ranks because we were busy with school. We were busy as young professionals. Maybe also we had kids or something at that point. And so we suppressed our creative interests. And I think that leads to frustration. And so what I encourage people, and I always go through this with people, is to figure out what are the things you like to do beyond your profession. They could be other jobs, like maybe you're a psychologist, but you also love to write. Right. Or they could be something that's just purely a hobby, like bird watching, for example. But whatever those things are, you should, in my view, you should try to figure out, there's two things. One, you should figure out, is your lack of creative outlet causing your burnout? Which I have seen this. In other words, you might actually still love your job, but because your job is preventing you from writing that novel that you've always wanted to do, you're resentful of your job. Not that you don't like it, but it stopped you from writing the novel. You've dreamed about writing this novel for a real long time, but you simply don't have time.
Yeah.
So if there's a way that you could keep that job and write the novel, you'd be much happier for it and much less burnt out. But I think the other thing, which you were getting at earlier, is if you have these different creative outlets, then they may be things to transition into later in life. It may be that you start writing now, and when you're older, maybe you don't want to do your job full time anymore. You want to do it part time, but you want to focus on writing, and you'll be much better off if you had started that earlier.
I'd like the reminder that we, in the process of attaining the positions we might want to have or establishing a career, getting a family going, there are a lot of things that we do suppress, and we have to, because it requires a different amount of energy. And in that suppression of those things, I've talked to people and I say, well, a little burned out or kind of going through some maybe depression, anxiety. I ask them, what do you like to do? And sometimes they'll say, I don't know. I can't remember, so I go back in the day and say, well, what did you like to do back in the day? And they'll kind of stop and reminisce and kind of harken back to some of the things that bring a smile to their face. And I'll raise probably something similar to what you raised is, well, how are those things in your life right now? And they're saying, well, they're non-existent. And it's easy almost to, where we have such ability for adaptation to adapt to not having balance in our lives anymore, and having those things that bring us joy and pleasure kind of have such a small margin in our lives to be experienced. And we have to almost create larger margins for these things to be reintroduced. But it's almost like learning how to play again, or to reestablish some balance. Do you notice the same thing?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And to add to what you just said, there's also the social aspect of it, which is that, many of us, our closest friends, we talked about this before the show briefly, our closest friends, maybe people we knew in elementary school or high school, people we knew a long time ago. Now, if you've moved away or they've moved away, you could be in Texas, they could be in Hawaii, and you kind of drift apart because you get in your world of work, maybe your kids fixing that leaky, roof you've got.
Right.
They're in their world and you don't see each other. And so one of the things that is clear from research is that having connections to people, particularly having some connections beyond your partner, is very important. You don't have to have a million.
No.
You have to have some.
Yeah.
You have to have some actual friends. And so one of the things I found, just as you ask people, what are your hobbies? I'll ask people, who are your best friends? And people don't know how to answer it, or they can answer it, but they haven't seen them in 10 years.
Right.
And so I think in addition to learning how to play, you have to relearn how to see people socially. And that may be deciding that, you know what, I'm going to take a week off work, not for any particular reason, but I'm going to fly out to Texas and see my old high school friends that I have not seen, only because I want to see them, not because there's a conference there or a work event or someone's getting married, but because I really want to reconnect with my friends.
Yeah, when you put it like that, and this is what I love, part of the Blue Zones piece as well. Folks, if you haven't watched, it's a beautiful show, and what Greg is talking about here is in line with this and what he's doing in his work, and we're going to get some sites that he's doing some great work on as well, so you guys can follow up after the show, because the message is a beautiful one. Having people in our lives, carving out time to do these things, carving out time to play for no other reason than having people in our lives to go play with, to have his contact. I mean, before the show, as you're referencing, you're in Atlanta, Georgia right now, and you just recently flew out to California to see some folks, where you were working. You were at Stanford, you were in UCLA, in that area. What a cool thing that you're doing. You're living, you're kind of walking your talk. You're living what you're saying. And people in our lives is one of the factors that has the greatest support around longevity. And it's attainable. It brings us joy. It helps us reconnect and kind of reintroduces us to ourselves that we have a memory of, but we don't sometimes always, we're not living day to day, huh? I bet you when you were with your friends, you're probably reminiscing and playing and laughing and, joking with each other. It had to be a great time.
Right. It was. And, here's, I think, a mistake that a lot of us make, and again, if you look at high performing people, most high performing people are very efficient and they're very committed. So it's almost hard for them to take a week off to catch up with people because that may rub them as like a waste of time. Well, if I'm going to take a week off, I should be going to a meeting, or I should be going to some country I've never visited before, or something like that. There is some functional aspect to things.
Yes.
And so if you take a week off to see your old friends, you almost may feel like you're wasting time, which is
Right.
totally the wrong way of
Isn't
looking
that
at
true?
things.
Yeah, isn't that true? Yeah,
That's what really matters in life.
it's so sad that we say, well, you know what? That's not going to work in, or I'm going to be wasting time. What a wrong mindset.
Right. Yeah, it is. And unfortunately, we programmed ourselves to believe that the only valuable use of our time is something that produces a tangible result like income, for example, or business opportunities.
Yeah, and we're the best kind of workers if we can squeeze every ounce out of, whatever we have to make it work versus where's that balance? I know that you do a number of things in your life, and you're going to be giving us some ways to follow up with you after our show today for our listeners to do. And there's some great sites you have. You also are involved with the Corsica conference, and I would love folks to learn a little bit more about that as listeners and what you're doing there and the goals in addressing wellness in that capacity.
So we have a twin project, the Corsica Conference and Corsica Longevity.
Mhm.
And the Corsica Conference's goals are to bring a professionally diverse or background diverse group of people together so they could meet each other. There's a social aspect to it, but also I'm hoping to be sort of a problem-solving aspect. You could almost think of it as a World Economic Forum Davos conference kind of thing.
Yeah.
In my mind, I think, well, how cool would it be if you could, let's say, have an event that would have a rocket scientist, an oil executive, and Beyonce together,
Yeah,
all
well,
at one event.
Yeah, but when I looked on your site, you're talking about a retired military leader, talking about the top threats to the U.S., about a NASA scientist, a Chinese expert, an anti-aging researcher. You got an AI expert coming in. You got a real estate expert talking about sales in the United States, and you got an adventure photographer that talks about his filming of things in the war zone. It was talk about a diverse group of people, but what fun interactions that must be together.
Right. And the trouble is that we often silo ourselves.
Yes.
We tend to hang out with people that are very similar to us in terms of background, professional position,
Yeah.
geographic location. And I think that limits us. I mean, anyone who's traveled will know if you spend a little bit of time talking to the people where you're visiting, you'll get a lot out of it, and you'll see something that you didn't know before. So I think the idea is the more you could expose yourself to in that way, the better, and the better you could produce. And then with Corsica Longevity, what we're trying to do is to help brands and businesses embrace concepts of wellness and longevity and include that in their products. In other words, if you're going to have an event at your store, why not have an event that focuses on health or longevity or connection or things like that? Because then not only is that good for your business, but that also is helping your clients because you're showing them ways they could eat better or ways they could have better relationships with their friends or ways they could sleep better. And you're kind of just making the world a better place, one business at a time.
I love that. You're talking about ways that we can be intentional and forward thinking in advance of our planning. Why not consider maybe building some of these things in? Because we get kind of myopic, over the years. The things, our vision becomes more, and you're talking about kind of opening the aperture in a way to say, hey, how can you build these other things? And sometimes they're just small things, maybe sometimes a little grander, but there are ways that we can intentionally build these things in to our lives that we may not be thinking about it. Isn't that right?
It is. And
Yeah.
I think we've become so transactional.
Yes.
And truthfully, I love Amazon. I use it all the time.
Yeah.
But we become so transactional. Almost everything we do, we do something because we're expecting a specific thing in return. We interact with people now. Say you're on LinkedIn or something, that's often transactional. You're expecting something, or someone's expecting something from you.
Right.
And so I think we're losing sort of touch with humanity, and that we should actually care about each other. I know it sounds a little sort of touchy-feely, but that we should actually care about each other, that we should care about making the world a better place. And to some degree, we should move away from this transactional way of being when we can. And I think that businesses could do it. I think you and I could do it. I love that you talk about these types of things in your podcasts.
Well, what I love that you're raising here is that we can build these things, but be intentional. And what's interesting that you're saying, we had a guest on this week on another podcast show, and we were talking about teens and how, we're more connected than ever before. No, we're not. We're not more connected, not in the right ways that you're suggesting. We have more connectivity, but it's all transactional. with the social media or, to the extent that you're saying with Amazon, we're not more connected, not in the right ways. We watch and we view, we follow, but we're not connecting in the ways that actually generates something good in our lives. We need the connectivity piece. We need the transactional piece, but it's almost like we've been shaped out of, or not shaped out of, maybe we've been, maybe shaped out of the importance of the connection. And we just forgot how important that is. And we get to remind ourselves to build that in conscious, intentional ways. I love that, Greg.
Well, to your point about connectivity without connection, my kids are middle school. So I see the kids that are at the bus stop that are getting picked up to go to high school because it's near our house. I see them all the time. There's maybe 4 of them that wait at this bus stop. They're each on their phones every morning, same thing. They're each on their phones. They're at almost 4 opposite corners of the bus stop. They're nearly as physically far apart from each other as they could be. They don't talk to each other or interact with each other at all. They're just on their phones, hoping to not be disturbed until they have to get together to be on the bus. And I just think, how different is that from, when we grew up, that you would hang out with the people at the bus stop and they'd be your friends and you joke around with them and you learned about life from them and you'd share stories with them. Now they don't want to have anything to do with their peers.
Right. And what you're raising here is that they may not know what they don't know about the downside of what you just described. This is all that they know. This is all they've been entertained with, and part of, I think, what our show was talking about the other day, and I think maybe what you're emphasizing here, what we get to do as parents is to come in and help shape some of that. There's a place for electronics and everything else, but there's also a place for the connected piece of our lives in real relational ways, where those things, when our kids used to come over, had friends over to our house, we had this big koa bowl and we would put their iPhones or whatever phone they had in the bowl. They didn't get to have, and for the first few minutes, they're kind of looking around going, what do we do? What do we do? And then all of a sudden they just started playing, and they started having some really nice times in what they were doing. So I love your emphasis here. We're kind of beginning to wind down, Greg, in the show for today, but if there was just something that our audience today listening could just take away and put into their day today to optimize their time, maybe to take a pit stop and maybe rediscover some things, maybe be maybe a little more introspective in this journey that they're on. What would you suggest as a practical takeaway step from our time today?
So I like to make lists for myself and follow them. So what I recommend is, I think this connection thing is really important. And I think it's undervalued and I think it's getting worse. So if I were to recommend one thing, I would say that you should make a list or a checkoff box or something. And each week, call, not text, but telephone, either a good friend or a relative or someone, not for any reason, but just to say hi and check on them. And I would try to do that every week. And at least 1 or 2 weeks a year, I would try to actually see people who don't live, or you drive to them or fly to them, whatever, but try to see people that you know. And I would make it a task, just like paying your taxes is a task or painting your house is a task. I would make it as a task. Every week you have to call someone, and at least once or twice a year, you have to see people that don't live near you, that are important to you.
I like that. So that's the prioritization piece. That's the part that says this is essential. It's not just an elective. You're suggesting, and I think you're right, that this is a requirement. This is kind of a foundational piece that we need to have in our lives to add to the beauty of it, to add to the joy of it, to continue to grow. And I love that emphasis. Well, as we wind down for today, Greg, I would love our listeners to be able to follow up after our show today. How can they learn more about you, your work, your initiatives, your programs? Where can they find you?
Well, the best way, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, Gregory Charlop, MD, GregoryCharlop, MD. Also my website, GregoryCharlopMD.com. I'm pretty active. I'm also on X. Oh, I forget what my handle is. I think it's Gregory Charlop MD also. But LinkedIn and my website are probably the best ways.
Nice. Well, Greg, I've been so enjoying our time today. Thank you for being on. I'd love to have you come back at some point, learn more about what you're doing and maybe some of the specific things you're doing or where areas of your life are growing, both professionally and personally. And but I want to thank you for your time today. It's been nice to be with you.
Well, thanks for having me on. I love the conversation. I love the work you're doing.
Appreciate it. I enjoyed it as well. Also want to thank you, our listeners, for dropping by and joining Greg and me today. It's always great to have you with us. Regarding our episode, I want to remind you that it and its resources and all of our other episodes can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. Thanks again for being with us on the show. I look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.